So for the second part of the tutorial, we're going to be going over the head sculpting for our character. And we're going to begin by adding a cube and just generally fitting that to about the size of our character's head. Then we're going to go into the modifiers tab and add in a subdivision surface with a level of 6, just so that we have plenty of geometry to work with when we're sculpting. And we don't have to worry too much about the poly count now because we're going to be retopologizing this head and the rest of the body later in the tutorial. So I'm just going to continue generally fitting the shape of my sphere to our player character. I'm going to go into sculpt mode now with a grab brush. Make sure you turn on enable symmetry and make sure that you apply your subdivision surface to your cube so that you actually are working with the geometry that you've created. Turn up the radius here just so that we can start grabbing and pulling the shape of this skull to fit our reference. I'm going to continue going between the front and side views just to make sure that this is fitting up with the reference that we have. Alright, and once I'm happy with the general shape of the skull, I'm going to go ahead and switch to the draw brush and create our eye sockets. I'm just going to go into the wireframe mode to see generally where the position of our eyes are, and it looks to be right about here. So now I'm going to use Control and just create the eye sockets of our character. Alright, and once we're happy with the shape of the head, I'm just going to go ahead and start creating nose. Side view. Now we're just going to start to create the general area for the lips. I'm going to use the inflate tool to create the bump of the mouth here. And then as you can see, where we have the start of the chin, the face slightly protrudes inward before we get to the chin. So it's going to create that indent area right there. That's a bit too exaggerated. That looks pretty good. Once we're happy with how the head's looking, we can go ahead and start to work on the neck. So I'm just going to turn on Dine Topo so we're able to extrude the neck and not have any issues with there not being enough geometry to work with. And I'm just going to start bringing it down like this. And then once I have a general shape that I like, I'm going to go ahead and switch to the grab tool with the large radius, turn to the right side view, and just start pulling like so. I think I have enough geometry to work with now, so I'm going to turn off Dine Topo and just work what we have. Alright, now that we have the general shape of our neck set up, I'm going to go in and start to refine the mouth. I'm going to start in our front view and just smooth this out a little bit because it's a little bit more defined than we would like. All right, that's good. Going to use the draw brush with a pretty small radius and just create the shape or outline of our mouth right here. Using control, sculpting in. That looks pretty good. And I'm actually going to go ahead and turn on Dine Topo for the lips here because we don't quite have enough geometry to work with. So this will just give us a little bit more when we're going in to sculpt in the finer details of the mouth. Alright, now that we have our mouth shaped out, we're going to go and add in the ears. We're just going to start by adding a mask at the general place where the ears will be. So I'm going to go into our right side view to go ahead and check. So that's going to be back around right here. So we can go and clear our old mask. For our mask. Just going to use the inflate tool to shape our ears. That looks pretty good. Gonna clear our mask. And now we can just go ahead and add some finer details on the ear. So for that, I'm going to turn on Dynatopo. Maybe you don't need that much fine detail. I'm going to be using a draw brush with a fairly small radius. Just going to use control to start shaping in the outline of our ear here. Everything as we go. And because we're doing a stylized character, this doesn't have to be too realistic by any means. And when I look at it here, the mouth is looking a little bit like it's protruding out too much, so I'm just gonna use a small brush to slightly smooth this to make the transition between where the cheekbone and upper lip are to be a little bit more smooth. And I think that's already looking a lot better. One key thing that I notice when working on mouths is that you want to make sure that the top lip area is protruding out slightly more than the lower lip, but it's all still connected in with the upper part of the face here and the cheekbones. Going to make this area here a little bit more defined for the lower lip. And we don't want him to be pouting too much. This might be a little bit extreme, so I'm going to use the grab brush to just bring his mouth up a little bit more. I'm going to turn on Dye Toppo just to give a little bit more geometry to the lower lip area. Now I'm just going to go in and sculpt a little bit more detail onto the nose. I'm going to turn Dye Toppo back on just so we can have a little bit more geometry to work with. I'm turning the detail size up a little bit because we don't want quite as much detail. Just a little bit more. That's looking pretty good. Gonna define the Cupid's bow just a little bit more. Okay. A little bit more volume in the upper lip. Took away a bit too much there. Great. Now the next thing that I'm noticing is that the eye socket here seems to be a little bit high. And if you look at the reference image, the top of where his eyebrow bone is should be a little bit lower. So I'm just gonna go in with the grab brush, pull that down a little bit. The next thing I'm noticing is I feel like the nose is a little bit too distinct. I want it to be a bit more in and connected to the face, so I'm just going to slightly smooth things out here around the top area. And the next thing here that I'm seeing is that we want to make sure that the lips are defined, and you can clearly see the definition of the top lip. So I'm just going to use the flatten brush here to make a distinct top lip. Same with the bottom. And we can just go in with the draw sharp tool and really create this crease between the top and bottom lip. And now that we have the mouth, nose, and eye areas refined, the next step is to go in and continue refining the ear. So I'm just going to go in with the draw brush and make sure that everything here is intentional and more defined. Once you're feeling pretty good about the shape of the ear, we can go ahead and add in our eyeballs. So I'm just going to go back into object mode and I'm going to add a sphere. Scale that down. And I'm going to just position this in the place of one of our eye sockets. And you can just position it until you feel that you have it in the proper place of where it should be in the head. That looks pretty good. Now I'm going to select that. I'm going to add a modifier, and I'm going to add the mirror modifier. And before we mirror it, actually, we're going to add in a new object. We're just going to add in a cube, scale it down, bring it to above our player's head. This is just going to be what we're going to use so that whenever we mirror something over, we're keeping symmetry and we're making sure that everything is uniform. So for our mirror object, we're going to select our cube. And now you can see we have our eyeballs mirrored over. Now that we have our eyeballs positioned, we are going to just try to form the eyelids around our newly positioned eyeballs. So here, as you can see, this is going to be the top of our brow bone. So we're just going to re-enter sculpting mode. And I'm actually going to exit sculpting mode because I had our eyeball selected when I entered it. So now we're just going to kind of build up our brow area and make sure that our eyebrows are nice and defined. That's great. Now we're going to come in here. I'm going to turn on Dynatopo so we have plenty of geometry to work with. And I'm just going to start creating our eyelids. And let's make sure our strength is pretty strong because we want to make sure that the eyelids are very distinct and distinctly not a part of the brow bone. Because that's a very common error, I think, that I have made a lot myself. So making sure that we're sculpting out our eyelids and they are being formed around our eyeball. All right, once we are happy with the eye shape, this just about wraps up our general face sculpting. And now it's time to, if you feel necessary, you can go in and tweak anything that feels off or anything that needs refining. For example, here, I think that the area around the chin should be a little bit more defined. I'm going to turn off Dynatopo, and I'm just going to define the chin a little bit more. Going to define his brow bone a little bit more. Soften his nose a little bit. The bow of his nose is looking like a little bit too inward, so I'm going to just bump it out slightly. Also makes him look a bit more masculine. I think that looks good. And here I'm still seeing some problems with the jawline not being defined enough. So I'm just going to go in and continue tweaking that until it feels like a hard enough jawline. Now the next step is the neck is looking a little bit undefined. So I'm just going to go in and start to define the neck muscles. Now that we've gotten the head to a point that we're comfortable with, it's time to move on to the next part of the tutorial, which is the body block out. The head we will come back to later on for retopology.